I call Simon O'Connor.
I'm not sure if one would call that philosophical or just sort of a litany of woes, which really just haven't, I think, got any impact whatsoever. I have to say, when I go around my electorate and other parts of the country, it's funny that nobody raises or mentions those issues at all. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you're talking to people out in the electorates, what they talk about is very much what we heard in the Prime Minister's statement, and I'll come to some of those bits later. I thought, though, to start, I just wanted to very briefly touch on Cyclone Winston. And, well, the primary reason for that, having lived and worked in Fiji, and in fact gone through a cyclone a few years ago there, to just speak, I suppose, in solidarity somewhat with the people there, to say to them, Anisam Bulavanaka na Kaiviti na Vanuaviti to them. Having been through a cyclone, it literally came up the driveway where I lived and blew the place apart. I can say that the people of Fiji are incredibly resilient. We often attribute the great smiling faces to them as a people, and despite this adversity, Mr. Speaker, I'm pretty sure those smiles will still be there. The one thing about cyclones is obviously you have a few hours of terror, if you will, but it's the damage that continues to be done afterwards. And I suppose in using a few minutes of this speech, it's to encourage New Zealanders and Kiwis to continue to be generous. The cyclone itself might destroy the buildings, but it also rips up the crops. Particularly with the Darlow plant, it turns it into a little helicopter and literally pulls it right out of the ground. So the first week you can actually go, as we did, and harvest some food and eat. But the weeks after, it begins to rot, and of course you begin to run out of food. And where we were cut off for about a month. And so your food supplies begin to run very low. The other thing, and those who have lived in the islands will know, all the sea salt gets blown up onto the land and actually scorches the land and the trees, and everything goes brown. It's not actually that they've been ripped out of the ground in that case, but again, scorched. So an encouragement to those listening and to New Zealanders as a whole, and to this House, to continue to support the people of Fiji. The cyclone is not just simply an activity of a few hours, but something that goes on for weeks and months. And in fact, even after I had left, after a couple of years, the damage of that particular cyclone that I went through was still being felt. So again, to the people of Fiji, to wish them well and strength at this time. Mr. Speaker, this remains a very strong and positive government. As I said, in the Prime Minister's statement, there's been a whole list of activities where we have performed incredibly strongly. We've heard everything from the increase in wages, an unemployment benefit which is falling and is expected to fall even further. And of course, an area of interest to myself is around healthcare, an incredibly positive story to be told there. And I think that's reflected in a couple of ways. First and foremost, we know that more elective surgeries are being done. And I note a couple of constituents this week who sadly have had to go to hospital. I'm thinking of Valerie in particular, if she's listening in, who wrote in and told me 6 days in hospital, but a remarkably excellent experience through the Auckland DHB. So we know not only that surgeries are going up, but the quality of surgeries are also seen as very positive. We know that extra funding has been put into the likes of palliative care. I think that's particularly good. To acknowledge the good people of the Eastern Bay's Hospice. Once again, those from Tamaki will know Eastern Bay's Hospice, or at the very least the Dove Shops, which raise an enormous amount of money for hospice care in our community. And it's one thing I always like to stress to the House, is that hospice, like that in Eastern Bays, is actually about where people are able to be at home and be supported. It's not like this little mini hospital filled with morphine and other drugs. It's actually a life-giving dynamic, and I want to thank all of those who work in hospice, but particularly those within my own electorate. We've got a whole lot of these new pain management teams out now. It's a lot of support, particularly for people with orthopaedic pain. Again, a really good news story. And I think that's somewhat reflected in the work of the Health Select Committee at the moment. It is and remains an incredibly busy Health Select Committee. Over the last year, and again, I think it's indicative of just how well the government's doing. We've seen more funds made available to assist carers. It was a bill we just passed actually 2 weeks ago in this House with unanimous support a bill under a national government for the first time to actually pay those providing care for the cost of transport. We're also updating the radiation safety, and I think later today actually we may have a chance to complete that piece of work. Last year we updated legislation around health practitioners. In other words, looking at the health industry in New Zealand and going, how do we increase the scope of practice for various professions? And the best example is things around death certificates or sick leave certificates, primarily the purview of medical practitioners, and we're saying actually scopes of practice have changed now, so why not see nurses and others be involved with that? And we've also modernised elements around health protection. So this was around regulation of sunbeds, Mr. Speaker, but also dealing with how we, I suppose, monitor infectious diseases. So again, a busy committee, but I think it's indicative of actually what is a very positive government making positive changes. I say, though, it's busy, and it's something I was sharing with some members of my constituency last week around the Select Committee, because petitions often come up, and I thought I would just give an indication of just some of the topics which the committee is looking at the moment, and to acknowledge those who have put these in. So there's quite a number of petitions before the committee. We're dealing with everything from surgical mesh to transgender operations, female prophylactics to tube weaning. So that's for young people who, babies mainly, who have to be fed by a tube. How do you wean them off that? It's quite a difficult process. We're looking at adrenaline autoimmune injectors or EpiPens, again, if you had an anaphylactic shock. We've been looking at a petition around public health and disability, pharmaceutical waste, assisted suicide, the DHB in Northland and services, pathology services. We're looking at maternity services, smoking, and just when you think we hadn't actually covered all the topics, moral, ethical, medical and otherwise, we're also looking at the whole element of cannabis sativex as well. So a rather busy, and I'd like to think a hard-working committee of all members, but I certainly say that of our government members, working incredibly hard. And so for me, Mr. Speaker, we are a government that remains incredibly focused, a government that is incredibly busy, and I think one that remains very much in touch with New Zealand. And one of the best gauges for me has been in the electorate. It's where I derive most of my strength and energy, is working with the good people of Tamaki, and they continue to talk about the things which matter. And most of what we've heard from the other side today is really just superfluous in many ways. It's not what really impacts on people. Health, absolutely. Education, for sure. Crime and law and order is incredibly important, knowing that they are safe in their homes. And of course, the economy is something there. But the people of Tamaki too have also understood that the government is behind them. And so in the last year in particular, we've had a number of successes, again, building on the good work of government. So money for a cycleway. I know the member for Auckland Central is very proud of her, I think, bright pink cycleway. Ours is not going to be pink, I understand, but we have a wonderful cycleway going from Glen Innes through to Tamaki Drive. We've had about 45 new classrooms for our schools promised, more money for Mandarin teaching. So there's a real, I suppose, positive amount of real positive work going on, particularly in the education field. And I'm very conscious that today in the gallery there's actually a young lady from now out of school, formerly of Glendowie College, to Grace, that actually we've got amazing young people who are in our communities, and I see that day after day, and I certainly see it when I go to the high schools and colleges in my electorate, be it Selwyn or Tamaki, Glendowie or Sacred Heart. Remarkable young people doing remarkable things, and this government is behind them. It's behind our education system, and also, as I was indicating earlier, it's really and strongly behind the health sector. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we have a very proud record as a government. I think the Prime Minister himself has articulated things very well and clearly in his statement. We are a government that talks about the things which matter. We're a government that remains very much in touch with the people of New Zealand. We are a government that's going to continue working hard because we are doing that listening, and if we need no better proof, it's just to look at the polls of where we are and where the opposition is.